Right, thank you, Beth. So Beth's already covered most of my introduction, I think, but in the seminar series, we want to talk about, I want to talk about, and Simon wants to talk about our research and work programme on the intersection between robotics and our interest in urban and environmental studies. And I guess the starting point, as we all know, is that technological advances across a range of fields have widened the scope for robotic machines to undertake more complex tasks in more complex environments, with the scope for greater connection between those machines, the potential to operate with increased autonomy and to exert greater influence over humans and ecology through the things they can do, their affordances, and their being in the world. So robot technologies are becoming more entangled, as Vincent Del Casino and his fellow authors suggest, in, quote, the making and remaking of the structures, conditions and relations of everyday life. And some of that is about replacing humans. But robots also change the ways in which things are done, maybe change our perception of the world, maybe change the ways in which we feel in terms of our being in the world. It's about augmenting, supplementing, transcending some of the limits to what humans and existing machines and infrastructures might do. We can think about that in terms of the way things are made, in the ways in which things are moved around, the ways in which things are extracted in surveillance and social control, in warfare, and not least in warfare, in healthcare, and many other aspects of human and ecological life. So robots are starting to rework the infrastructures of human life in potentially significant ways. Now, that's a huge agenda, isn't it, to cover, and extends into issues to do with digital and data-driven automation, into artificial intelligence, and so on, and the ways in which robots are used in a whole range of contexts. It's also about anticipating the future as well as understanding what's happening now in terms of the rapid development of robotic technology. So we'll cover some of those broader issues raised by the application of robots across different domains of economic and social life. But our specific focus, as Beth said, is on two strands. And to think in this lecture on an urban strand, what we call urban robotics in our work programme. And then Simon's going to talk next week, in the next lecture, about the use of robots in the management of nature, ecology and climate. That's sort of one of the other strands of our work programme. And as Beth said, this sort of draws on research undertaken over a number of years, over 10 years now, over a decade in the Urban Institute. And when the Urban Institute was set up, one of the theme groups we set up was to do with automation and robotics. And at the time, sort of that connection to the urban and automation and robotics wasn't particularly being researched. There was a lot of work on smart cities, but not necessarily on robotics. And what we were taking advantage of is the opportunity in the Urban Institute to do something new and different, to set up, to think differently. And the Urban Institute still performs that role. And we thought of it as a sort of an open space to be creative and different and exploratory, and to take a chance on a research area to explore a set of issues that we didn't know a huge amount about, but we could see were becoming more and more significant. There's now a huge body of literature, I guess, a growing body of literature, quite a wide range of literature on the sort of things we were looking at, but there wasn't much when we started. We've been able to extend that work through, as Beth says, the current ESRC project that we're working on, experimenting with urban robotics as a new urban infrastructure, which is a project that is led by me and Simon, and we're working with our researcher Brendan Doody. I should also thank a number of people who have been part of that journey who are no longer with us, but they're still alive, but no longer with us. They've moved on to other things. Rachel McCrory, Andy Lockhart, and Matea Kovacic in particular, but also the wider support of the Urban Institute. So I'm going to focus on the urban robot research, and my lecture is about understanding or exploring how robots might be used in cities. And the questions we've been exploring about what might be distinctive about what robots are doing, can do in cities. Is it something that urbanists and or environmentalists should pay attention to. So in the research that we do, all of us in this room, there are lots of things we might pay attention to. There are lots of things we might research. Should we pay attention to robotics? Where might that fit in? And I think that's an open question. How much time should we spend thinking about robotics alongside all the other things we might look at? How important are they? What are their implications? We've got a particular focus on sort of what might worry us around robotics. So as I guess, critical urban researchers, what is it that we're trying to do here in our robotics research, and particularly in the ESRC project, about what I would call rendering visible some of the less visible, less tangible, less immediate impacts of robotics. So those are the sort of things I want to talk about. Questions around who or what might benefit, who or what might be disadvantaged by the use of robots, in my context, in terms of cities, in Simon's lecture, in terms of ecology and environment, asking the question, what matters, what might we be concerned about, what might need to be governed and regulated, and in what ways. So the structure is as follows. I'm going to start by thinking about the definition of robotics and spend a little bit of time on that, and think about sort of how we're defining it. And then I'm going to talk about the term we use, urban robotics, and what the focus is of that research. So it's not all aspects of robotics, neither it is all aspects of how robotics work its way through urban lives. But I want to explain what we're looking at and why. And at the core of the presentation is a wider discussion about what the research focus might be for critical research. So in terms of arriving at a definition, and we spent quite a lot of time thinking about definition, and I think definitions are important in this sphere. So all of us, I guess, have an idea or some idea of what a robot might be, what it might look like. If I had longer here, I'd get us all to think about what our definition might be of a robot. So what is sort of intrinsically robotic about robots? And I do think those definitions are important. So the definition that we've sort of arrived at the top here is a machine. It's any machine, and I think the notion of the machine is important, that operates at a distance from human control, either autonomously or through different levels or different forms of human intervention. Different intervention and control. So we're interested in the material presence of robotics. So if you think about our wider interest in automation, it's the material presence of robots, the fact that they exist. They're a material thing that we have to negotiate or that can do things in the world. Much is made of robots operating autonomously, and if we think about where literature's at in terms of the future of robotics, or robotics taking over the world, or having too much control, is around the issue of autonomy. But for us, that's not necessary as a starting point in terms of our research. If we think about, for example, the use of drones in warfare, those drones are remotely operated. Autonomy doesn't have to be at the core of the definition of a robot. Of course, robots will become increasingly autonomous, or increasingly not full, and they will have an increasing degree of autonomy. But I think that one of the interesting questions is the balance between autonomy and human oversight, override, and accountability. So we're not just interested in autonomous robots. One of the things that we're particularly interested in around machines is we're thinking about what that machinic material kinetic presence means in terms of the design, layout, and infrastructures of places. I'm particularly interested in sort of infrastructures of everyday life and what robotics means for infrastructures. Do we call robotics an infrastructure? Is that part of our definition or not? Are robots embedded in other kinds of infrastructures? So that's one thing we might begin to think about. And sort of that machinic focus gets us also to think that human life and the infrastructures in which we operate have long been about coexistence with machines, haven't they? And I think thinking about where robotics fits into this wider sense of places in human life, about sort of the embeddedness of humanism and other organisms within social technical systems. And so that's why in our definition, that sort of machinic element is important. And of course, machines have shaped the ways in which humans have shaped human activity and infrastructures in all kinds of ways. And then with sort of, it was really interesting to go to Matthew Gandhi's work, paper on cyborg cities from 2004, and that emphasis that cities are cyborg, so robots are not. So this has always been this combination of machines, a hybrid, as Matthew Gandhi said, of machines and organisms in which humans and machine technology co-evolve. So there's a longer history here, which I think is important in terms of thinking about where robots impact on, where they intersect with, where they layer onto existing infrastructures, and whether that's in terms of infrastructures of the private car with autonomous vehicles, or infrastructure of the smart city in terms of that data infrastructure. So that's one reason why that machine dimension is important. Of course, there are lots of other ways of defining robots. Elliott, sociologist, wrote in 2017 that robots are part of a new protocological infrastructure which collects, sorts, calculates, and acts upon vast quantities of digital information. Ian Shaw, the Dr. Ian Shaw, 2017, argues that the autonomous robot materializes new modes of algorithmic being in the world. And I'll return to some of those ideas later on in the talk. So we might talk in that respect about the connections between robots and other things, the ways in which robots are embedded in other structures and flows and analytical frameworks around data and communication. We might talk about robots using other language and Internet of Robotic Things. The UK government has recently produced a strategy which talks about cyber physical infrastructure. I think the issue of language is important here in definition in terms of getting a grasp on what we mean by robots and what it means for the ways in which we think about society and space. You might disagree, you might think that's all a bit pointless, but I'll come back to those issues of definition. But we're not. I'm not talking today about all aspects of robotics. I'm thinking about urban robotics, the ways in which robots might sort of shape relationships in places and around infrastructures. So a broad urban perspective on the robot could encompass all of the different ways in which robots are deployed in workplaces, in the home, in medical care, in gardens, in schools, and so on. So ideally, an urban perspective would encompass what goes on in the private realm and what goes on in the public realm. I'm not going to consider all those things in the private realm. I think there's a really interesting set of relationships between ways in which robots are used within the private realm, within buildings, and the ways in which they're used in the public realm. But I want to focus on the public realm. There's too much to consider if we do that wider urban perspective. And we've been particularly interested in robotic applications in the public realm of cities. So our ESRC project is about the public realm of cities. The ways in which robots occupy what might be called the urban commons, encompassing public spaces and infrastructure that ought, in principle, to be freely accessible to all, which is a principle that sort of drives quite a lot of the research that we do. And as we know, those spaces are not necessarily free and accessible spaces for everybody. The public realm gets managed, governed, regulated, partitioned in various ways. So some of the things we're looking at when we think about urban robots, so let's sort of try to give you a sense of the sort of things we're looking at. We're looking about robotic things in the sky, drones, autonomous flying vehicles. We're looking at drones on roads and pavements, so autonomous vehicles again, service robots, police robots, maintenance and security robots. And we've started with a wide brief of trying to map what's happening in terms of robotic activity in those spaces. And robots can take many forms. So on this slide, I've got your top left-hand corner, robotic delivery vehicle. There's a robotic taxi, there's robotic police, there's drones, there's autonomous vehicle, and so on. So those are the sort of things that we're interested in terms of open robots. And one of the things we're interested in is the variety of forms that robots can take. So I could have slides, and I've had to restrict myself from showing you slides and slides and slides of robots in the various forms. So this is there are many other slides I could show you, but and robots are evolving, aren't they? They've become bigger. Robotic sort of vehicles, robots in various ways might become bigger. They've become smaller, and we think of nano robots, smaller drones, and so on. So the forms in which robots take is a really interesting question, and the ways in which they interface with humans is also an interesting question. And the robotic form, the forms that robots take now, are not necessarily the forms that robots will take in the future. Again, it's something I want to consider in a bit more detail. So as is, I guess, a partial urban perspective, and we're sort of interested in issues around rights to the city, rights to infrastructure, the ways in which robots might reshape, rework social spatial relationships in the public realm and around infrastructure. I guess another way of thinking about robots is to think about the work that they do. So I was trying to think, where do I start from in showing you examples of urban robots? Do I show the different sort of different robotic forms and the space and their spatialities, or do I start with the work that they do? And I guess with urban robots, we're primarily thinking of logistics and delivery systems, police, security and surveillance, and mobility. I guess those are the three main areas, but we might be able to, there might be other areas, but that's the core area of interest. But we can also think about, another cut in is to think about the work that robots do. So if we're thinking about a police robot, the robots used by police forces, they take many different forms. If we're thinking about delivery and logistics, the use of robots can take many different forms and operate in many different ways. Here's just a handful of examples of police robots. There's a police robocop. There's to your bottom right, there's a vehicle that can be attached with weapons on bomb disposal. That's being used, particularly in US cities. There's an interest in the sort of robots. To the middle on your right is a traffic management robot from Kinshasa in Democratic Republic of Congo. Police robots take many forms. One of the things I've got particularly interested in is on the right, on the top right, is the thing called a Throwbot robot, and the Throwbot is made by Recon Robotics, and what the Throwbot does is it's described by the company that makes them as a throwable micro-robot platform that enables operators to obtain instantaneous video and audio reconnaissance within indoor and outdoor environments. It's designed to withstand repeated drops of up to 30 feet, so it's strong and robust. It can be thrown into hazardous situations in order to allow operators to quickly make informed decisions when seconds count. It can crawl over a variety of terrain. It can be converted to carry up to 1.8 kilogram of payload and to cross obstacles up to 10 centimeters tall. One of the things that interests me is to get us to think about the form that robots take. They take very different forms and can do lots of different things. The Throwbot, of course, was initially designed, the Throwbot was initially designed to operate in military warfare situations. It is now used by a number of US police forces. And if we begin to think about the affordances, what do robots do? What are the places they can go? How can they go to places where humans can't go? How do they begin to change the nature of decision making and human action in the world? And just as an example of the Throwbot process. So one of the dimensions of our research is to try and think about sort of what robots might begin to look like in the future. So the forms that we have of robots, which might look fairly benign at times, are not necessarily the forms of robotics that we'll end up with in the future. And I think research needs to anticipate some of those changes. Many of those police robots, and we'll return to police robots later on in the talk, draw on technologies that are tested and finessed in warfare. Again, a strand of what we're trying to do is to look at innovation systems around robotics. Who's involved in developing robotic systems? What are those links between the spaces in which robotics are tested and experimented in, and the ways in which they find their way into the city? So as Ian Shaw has argued, the electronic battlefield has seeped into the bedrock of the modern smart city. So robotic restructuring needs to pay attention that our agenda to the different spaces and functions of robots across various forms of activity. And that might be within and beyond cities. So we might begin to think about how places are connected or not connected through access to robotics as well. One of the strands of our research, and I think Simon will talk about it more next time, has been to think about how robotics has extended the potential ability of humans to exploit ecological resources, natural resources, by enabling for extraction in places were too dangerous, too difficult, too expensive for humans to go. Cold spaces, hot spaces, outer space. So we can also, so I think that's part of the urban agenda as well, that sense in which robotics gets us to think about extended urbanism. So robots are increasingly finding their way into cities in these various forms. And if they're not quite there yet, and I'm speaking from Sheffield, there aren't very many robots about in Sheffield. I'm not sure when that might be the case. But if they're not there yet, there is activity and pressure to open up cities through regulatory change, trials and experiments, sort of common operating systems and so on, to robotic use. And one of the first things we started off doing with the ESRC project is doing a global mapping exercise, trying to map evidence of any use of robotics in the public sphere of cities anywhere in the world. And this next slide isn't great. I was going to do a map, but it was too difficult to read. What we've found, and we'll make this database available, give more information on the initiatives, is there are over 2,000 initiatives of robots being actively used in the public realm of cities. Now, I think there's much more than this, because clearly we were limited by our access to data and information. So it's a partial picture, but it shows the extended use of robotics in places. And we could spend quite a bit of time thinking about what sits beneath these figures. They're interested sort of geography there in terms of the places in which robots are being used, in terms of the sorts of applications that in different places, in different continents, and we could break that down even further. Just to flag up, in North America, and almost 1,500 examples of robots being used in policing. I think the figure is higher than 41 for Europe, given I think that 33 out of the 40-odd police forces in the UK currently use drones for various forms of activity. So I think these figures underestimate sort of thing the extent to which robotics are being used. What's of interest for us is not just the figures in terms of initiatives, but what sits beneath it, what sort of initiatives and where. And I suppose I call this the first wave of robotics. It's about trials and experiments, and quite a lot of this is around sort of novelty robots, shuttle buses, and robots being used for particular events rather than fully fledged robotic applications. That's the first wave, and what we're trying to do is sort of see the signs of the shift to a second wave of the embeddedness of robotics much more centrally in terms of different urban functions. So we're working on that database and sort of and developing that. I think one of the things that sits beneath that urban mapping is not just the robotic initiatives, but we've also been mapping strategies and future strategies. If you've got time to Google the South Korean future policing strategy for 2050 is an interesting read in terms of the vision of robotic policing. And what those strategies, there's a lot of work going on which is not visible. It's this thing, robots in a sense are very visible. Research on algorithms and AI is about rendering visible what's not necessarily visible in terms of the work the data analysis might do. Robots are very visible on one hand, but lots of lots of the potential impacts, the worrying impacts, are not visible. So there is a case of for research, our research in making robots robotic potential and the potentialities of robot much more visible. I think one of the things about that first wave of experimental landscape is that it's largely about the private sector. It's largely about the private sector, whether it's private sector firms that make drones, and if we go back to the Throwbot, it's a private sector firm that makes the Throwbot. You can buy a Throwbot. I didn't look to see how much they are, but and I don't know what restrictions there are on buying them. But it's largely about the private sector, and it's by robotics firms, small and large, or service providers, whether it's Amazon, Ocado, and so on, who might make use of robotics. And there's a lot of pressure on cities to open up, to change regulations, to allow for experimentation, for trialing, for applications. So, and some of that is about firms trying to enhance what they do. Some of that is about firms seeking to exploit new frontiers for urban profitability. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of pressure from the private sector. And as I say, not least in terms of finding ways to extract profit, to enclose what was previously the urban commons, the sky, the roads, the pavement, to monetize some of those dimensions of the urban environment. Governments and police forces are increasingly buying into robotic technologies to enhance service delivery, to solve problems, sometimes because robotics is a symbol of modernity and innovation, and sometimes to support economic and technological innovation, sometimes simply because it feels like the future. So we're sort of mapping out that relationship between the public and the private sector, and I'd argue it's largely been about the private firms seeking to open up urban spaces. And in some respects, then, the sort of robots have become the latest trope for urban development. So we've sort of seen various ideas become the dominant idea for the future of cities, whether it's sort of eco-cities, smart cities, and we're beginning to see robots being embedded in future visions for cities. This is the example of Neom, the megacity proposed and planned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and sort of it's interesting to see where robots fit into that structure. An artificial moon will light up each night, flying taxis, robot security, robot maids, all that looks sort of fair enough. And then at the bottom, all citizens can be tracked as one of the selling points of the ways in which robotics will be embedded in Neom. And we can see those similar sort of robotic visions coming through. This is Toyota's Woven City in Japan. So sort of robotics as an emblem of the future. And there are different logics at work and different justifications in those different urban robotic applications. For logistics, it's part of a seamless, sort of that search for a seamless, frictionless movement of goods from the warehouse to the home, sort of, if you like, extending the logic of the warehouse out to the city. We've done some work with some of the logistics providers, And their interest isn't just in sort of the robotic delivery, but then redesigning the interface of houses so that the delivery can go straight into houses. So removing unruly, difficult humans from that process, but also sort of freeing up delivery from difficult things like congestion in principle. So robots, as Ian Shaw points out, create disruptive geographies. But of course, doing this is not easy. And there's a danger here that we sort of just, I suppose for us as researchers, that we overestimate the pace of change. And it's not easy embedding rolling out robots into the urban realm. Robotic restructuring, robotic rollout, whatever we call it. So robots are expensive. Human-robotic interaction is really difficult. Robots to work effectively in urban places need a supportive infrastructure, whether it's an infrastructure of sensors, communication infrastructure. If you're thinking about drones, if you are to have a drone delivery system, and it's likely to be along a securitized, protected air corridor, and it needs a hub, it needs some way of connecting the warehouse into the city at the moment. So these things are not necessarily easy. And one of the things that's going on in cities around this sort of relationship between the public and private sector is the search for effective ways of building those infrastructures, creating spaces. I should have said robots have issues in terms of public safety, and that is something that will need to be developed. So over time, humans will get used to dealing with robots and existing with them, but that needs to develop over time as well. So it's not necessarily the case that this is going to unfold unproblematically. And as I say, a lot of the initiatives we looked at were novelty schemes and sort of segregated spaces that were relatively easy to introduce for robots to be introduced. I think it's important to sort of grasp that urban robotic construction will be incremental. It will be geographically differentiated. It will be fragmented. So one of the things we've tried to do is think about the connection between different aspects of urban robotics while recognizing that the different spheres of activity are actually different spheres. They're not necessarily all connected. And as I talk about in a bit, that sort of incremental element might be of concern to us, because when things are incremental, some of their implications slip through the system because they're not a sudden change. So some of these initial robotic experiments sort of soften us up to robots. Robots might be quite benign. They might not be doing very much at the moment that worries us. But as they gradually extend their influence, at what point do we begin to intervene in that process? So it's the very incrementalism that sometimes worries me about this shift from a first wave to a second wave of robotics. So robots and cities will co-evolve. So we might map those emerging processes of thinking about how the city's being opened up to robotics, how cities are being reworked. But I think we need to anticipate future change in terms of the nature of robotics and the work they do. I should have put up this David Harvey quote that I'm not going to talk particularly about the impact on work. That's a significant, huge area, but I'm not going to talk about that. But suffice it to say, David Harvey, right, the robots do not complain. They don't answer back. They don't sue. They get sick, go slow, lose concentration, go on strike, etc., etc. So the idea of transcending the limits of unruly humans is part and parcel of this agenda, but I won't say any more about that. In terms of critical geographies or ethical geographies of urban robots, I want to just focus on two main issues to flag up, and this is about sort of thinking where robots take us, what might matter, what might we get concerned about. I'm not sure they're hugely earth-shattering in terms of flagging up those issues, but I'm going to talk about partitioning and enclosure and surveillance and social control. Robots can enhance social life and the social good. there's lots of robots might do that is good for us. I'm not going to do a long list, but for example, one of our early projects was to explore blood delivery for transfusion to remote areas in Rwanda via drones. We might think of potential benefits for mobility for supporting independent living through autonomous vehicles. Lots that robots might do that are good for individuals, good for society generally. And I suppose the ethics of robots in general has been in part question, how do we ensure that the application of robots benefits the social good rather than enhancing the ability, for example, to kill at a distance, to control populations, to do the bad things. So lots of talk about robots for good and sort of how we might work to achieve that. So, but what I want to think about is the things that might concern us about robotic applications. And I suppose the concern in terms of the way that robots unfold, and this is why I'm flagging up the role of the private sector, is that robots, the ways in which they might be used and unfold might reflect the logics of private sector firms rather than governments. And I think there's an interesting issue around that balance between governments and the private interest. So who's driving this agenda and where does it begin to take us? So robots have the potential to rework infrastructural relations in all kinds of ways. Apart from the implications for employment, robotic logistics might seem to be fairly benign. I guess sort of the idea of Amazon using drones or autonomous vehicles to get rid of the last mile problem of delivering goods to houses. But there are high entry costs to those sorts of systems, particularly given the infrastructures that they require, that perhaps privileges some firms over others, potentially locking citizen consumption into increased dependence on certain providers. As I work on drones, and some of the work that came out of Rwanda was about the need to securitize the skies. And what does that mean in terms of privileged access for providers who can meet or pay for that regulatory compliance? So even some, I was thinking of the different spheres we're looking at in our urban work, logistics might be seen to be the one that's least politicized, but even logistics and delivery raises not insignificant issues about the roles of robots in reworking infrastructure in everyday lives. If we could autonomous vehicles each one of these different areas could be a talk in itself, but some of the issues around autonomous vehicles, for example, Stephen Parks and Ed Ferrari have recently produced an interesting document for the regional studies that's looked at the different impacts and potential impacts of autonomous vehicles. But they and others have drawn out attention to the various ways in which autonomous vehicles might price out the less affluent, the ways in which they might undermine public transport and other modes of collective mobility, or lead to a renewed enthusiasm for cars, the ways in which they might lead to a more intensively used road space, or underpin an argument for the extension of road space. So lots of other issues in terms of access to autonomous vehicles, the extent to which autonomous vehicles, and we need to think about connected autonomous vehicles, connected to automated mobility systems, begin to open up scope for premium pricing and premium access to different forms of road space and so on. So as Bissell has argued, just like previous mobility systems, access to connected and autonomous vehicles is likely to be unevenly distributed across class and racial lines. So we could do this for each application of robotics. Summa Chojo and our joint authors writing recently in Transactions talk about the potential for a partitioning of the city, or a new partitioning of the city for robots, new forms of uneven access to public goods and what should be public freely so evenly accessible public infrastructure. So that's one set of dimensions, partitioning and enclosure, and the ways in which robots might be layered onto, the ways in which existing spaces are segregated and divided up, and existing inequalities in terms of access to infrastructure in the public spaces of the city. The second dimension I want to think about is surveillance, policing and social control. And the first point to make here is all robots are data gathering machines. They vastly extend the potential, this is nothing new, is it? But they vastly extend the potential for the surveillance, tracking, hunting, corralling and control of humans. Either because of the places they can go, or for the relatively low costs of, for example, a drone machine and other robotic surveillance machines. Okay, they're the potential for surveillance that supplements and goes well beyond CCTV and helicopters, which would be the main form of surveillance. And that's extended further with the potential for smaller drones and nano drones and swarm drones and robots. Robots can be linked to facial recognition and other biometrical assessment systems, such as emotional recognition or voice pattern recognition. So beginning to think about those various forms of sort of biometrical assessment, which can be built into a police or security robot. And they can be weaponized and used to exert force and control at a distance. And I have got this interest in sort of robots that look fairly benign. So this is the Ambot, a Chinese security robot, which I don't know whether it looks lovable or not, or if that's the word, but it looks fairly. But until you realise that it's equipped with tasers, facial recognition, and an extendable cattle prod to be used in riot control, should it need to be. Now that isn't just because it's a Chinese robot. If we begin to look at the ways in which robots are being used in the US fairly extensively across US police forces, a whole range of robots are being used in principle around sort of non-lethal force, non-lethal weapons, i.e. robots have been used to kill people. But the use of robots, if they're not killing people, there's a significant potential for control of humans in all kinds of ways. So one of the there's a drone with weapons, autonomous drone with weapons, and of course, policing is not just about police forces, which may or may not be accountable in terms of accountable to the public. There's a big market out there in personal security, personal or organizational security devices. This is SMP's AI security patrol robot, facial recognition. So if you don't meet its requirements to be in that space, it's a private space, but I think the relationship between public and private becomes interesting here. And an example again of that sort of extension of security and control. So all kinds of issues here in terms of, this is part of a much broader agenda. So where does that take us in terms of the nature of policing, the nature of surveillance and control in cities? The potential for autonomous policing through the urbanization of military robots, for predictive policing is wide-ranging. Where does accountability lie in decisions to shoot to kill or to control people that are made by robots? Where does that lie? Might an autonomous robot, appropriately regulated, be fairer or less biased than a human? Might it react differently in a situation where there is a decision to shoot to kill? Might its reaction time be quicker? Might it be a robot be more dispassionate? So, but these are sort of significant issues, as I'll talk about, need to be, I think, discussed now as robots are being used increasingly by police forces across the world, with a significant extension of that. And of course, a police robot, a security robot, isn't just a sort of shift in the nature of explicit control. It changes the psychological and emotional landscape for those under surveillance, a more intensive and invasive form of state power. So those are sort of just beginning to think about the ways in which urban robotics might be a cause of concern, some of the things that we might want to pay attention to as urban researchers. There are other issues, there are other ways of thinking about the impact of robots. I haven't got time to go into detail here. I suppose one of the final thing I want to think about is around what I call the robotic public sphere, and the extent to which there is a space politically at national level and within cities to think about the issues that robotics use raise, the social issues, the implications of the use of robotics. And I suppose it's become an increasing part of the research that we're doing, is to think about spaces of resistance, to think about evolving policy process. And so there's lots out there in terms of the need to regulate robotics, AI, and algorithms. So not academics in the public sphere. And so there's a lot of debate about this. I think one of the questions we're starting to raise is, well, what happens to that? What happens to that in terms of where that discussion is being had, what's the nature of that discussion, and what the implications of it, alongside the actually existing rollout of robotics? What's the connection between those geographically embedded sets of political processes and the nature of sort of robotics itself? We got quite interested in, and I guess many issues to do with robots might not be so difficult if there were appropriate regulatory and policy frameworks in place. And it's the political voids around the robot that most concern me. So we can begin to anticipate what the implications of robots might be. And perhaps we should be having those discussions and those debates now in order to anticipate the robots. If we had a set of principles, for example, around mobility in the future of cities, that were clear about what matters in terms of the relationship between the individual car and quality of life, or sustainable development, environmental goals, social goals, then the robot would fit into that. So in the absence of some of those debates, the robot has latitude, or robotic developers and people who are involved in the development of robotic applications have more latitude in which to set the agenda. I just want to talk a bit about San Francisco, and we've been researching San Francisco for a long time, and one of the things that one of the reasons for that is San Francisco's got a lively politics of the public realm. People are interested in it. There's a politics of it. People will defend the rights to the public realm in San Francisco. The city of San Francisco banned robots from the public realm in 2017, following growing political and public concern about surveillance and control. 2017, the city banned robots. And this was brought to a head when the society, the local organisation for the Society for Protection of Cruelty to Animals, was using a robot to disperse homeless people from around its premises. Again, the public-private interface is really interesting there. And it was the first city in 2019 in the US to ban the use of facial recognition software by police. However, in 2022, the city's Board of Supervisors gave local police the right to weaponize the city's 17 robots. The 17 robots being used by the police, and to use lethal force if there was sufficient threat to the public or the police. And so there's lots in that story, in the San Francisco story for me, of a very active political resistance to the extension of robots. And I should say, in between, the city had a permitting system for delivery robots and become more open to the idea of robots. But in that short space of time, robots shift from being something that's not acceptable in the city or a worry to something that's being actively embraced. The other bit of that story, and this is the slide I've got up here, is that there was a public backlash, there was an organised resistance against that proposal. And in the end, the proposal was withdrawn, a space of resistance. That's San Francisco. But where else might we see those forms of resistance? Where else? I'll be seeing it in any other place in the US, as robot police forces are increasingly being weaponized and moving into different realms. So I think these spaces of resistance become important. The questions that have been asked or not asked in different places. And then, as part of that, we're sort of interested in sort of attempts to think about the regulatory framework. I think this is a really interesting document. It's an independent review from an independent advisory group on new and emerging technologies in policing, commissioned by the Scottish Government, reporting in 2023. And there's lots in documents and similar documents. So the idea of regulating AI and robots and emerging technologies in the public realm is not a new thing. And you might see that I've got particularly interested in policing because I think this is where it's the hard area around regulatory and political debates, and I think it has implications for other forms of robotics. Some of the things that come out in that report are there need to be very strict, the recommendations, very strict ethical codes and laws to be implemented for the use of autonomous security robotic devices in policing. Key stakeholders and members of the public are to be involved in the formulation of police guidelines concerning the use of these technologies. There's a need for development and provision of guidelines and clear processes for the scrutiny, regulation, enforcement of biometric identification systems, particularly facial recognition. There needs to be mandatory equality impact assessments to be introduced when new technology is being used by the police. A development of a set of shared concepts and terminology around an ethics of algorithms. And there's lots more of this. I'm just picking out some of those policy recommendations. It'll be fascinating to see what happens to that. And one of the questions I raise is, well, what space? Where is the space to do that? Where are the resources to do that? Over what timescales? Who is it that develops an ethics of what algorithms? And what does an ethics of algorithms applied in that context really look like? And so, sort of an interest in these attempts to regulate at the urban scale, rather than being more abstract national frameworks for say, regulating AI, to think about what's going on in terms of thinking about the urban. And that depends on where the scale of decision making is, of course, around the urban. So in San Francisco, a lot more powers in the American system at the urban scale in terms of being able to regulate and think about the future of robotics in its various forms. And then, so my concern is about political voids and the spaces to do those things, because I'm not sure those sorts of discussions and debates happen anyway with regard to sort of what we might call as non-robotic or conventional police forcing, or the ways in which we think about the direction of cities at the moment anyway. They're not, I don't think they're there. And if they were there, perhaps we wouldn't need to think or worry so much about the difference that robots might make, because those frameworks would already be in place. And there's an interesting quote from that report around what would be a hopeful place in terms of engagement with the work that robotics does. Instead of, and the quote is, instead of debating what AI will or will not be able to do in the future, we should be asking what we want from our criminal and justice system and how AI could help us to achieve it. Our ambitions are unlikely to be delivered merely by replacing officers with computers, but think what might be achieved in a human-machine team where each learns from and adds value to the other. But what if we subjected human beings to the same scrutiny that we quite rightly place on AI, exposing our biases and assumptions to ongoing and constructive challenge? And it is, I think that idea there, that if we can sort of engage with, societally, politically engage with robotics in various forms, and maybe its visibility and the places it might take us, might get us to reflect a little bit more on the sort of choices that are being made anyway in cities that are not always politically debated, not always subjected to discussion, debate, and engagement. And rather than do a strict, I've got a conclusion to what I'm going to do. I'll finish there. So thank you for coming and thanks for listening.